The drop pod shook violently as it pierced the thin atmosphere of Cathara, a planet known for its unrelenting heat and merciless terrain. Inside the sleek, temperature-controlled capsule, 9 alien cadets checked the readouts on their suits. Their skin tones ranged from luminous blue to jade green to burnt copper, each representing a different species under the Galactic Accord. All wore advanced survival suits designed to regulate temperature, humidity, hydration, and neural stress. Each suit cost more than a small freighter, and each cadet had trained for months in climate simulation domes to prepare for what lay below. Every cadet believed this trial would be grueling, but manageable. After all, they had the best tech the galaxy had to offer. Only one person in the pod wasn't adjusting suit settings. Lucas Bray sat quietly on the edge, tightening the rough fabric of his tan survival wrap around his shoulders. His clothes were Earth-made, primitive by alien standards. A breathable weave of cotton poly blend, reinforced with ceramic mesh where the sun would hit hardest. No helmet, no built-in cooling system, just a desert scarf, dark goggles, a hand-carved wooden compass, and a metal flask hanging from his belt. As the pod stabilized for landing, he calmly applied a thin layer of mineral paste to his cheeks and nose, rubbing it into his skin with slow, practiced movements. It smelled like chalk and dried salt. The others stared at him in disbelief. One cadet, a towering female Draskian with segmented armor and glimmering red eyes, tilted her head toward him and let out a clicking laugh. "Human, where is your suit? Do you intend to die before the trial begins?" Lucas looked up, unfazed. "No suit. I trained in the Mojave." She made a scoffing noise and turned away. A younger cadet from the floating Zalari species, whose body shimmered like oil in water, hovered slightly above the floor. "What is Mojave?" he asked in a high, airy voice. Lucas wiped his fingers on his pants. "A place back on Earth. Hot, dry, deadly if you're stupid." That was the end of the conversation. None of the cadets were interested in Earth lore or Deathworlder philosophy. They were here to prove themselves. As the pod doors hissed open and the blast of furnace-hot wind rushed inside, each cadet activated the heat seals on their suits. Lucas just squinted into the brightness, adjusted the scarf around his neck, and stepped out onto the sand. The surface of Cathara was a sprawling desert of cracked black rock and fine orange sand that shimmered with toxic minerals. The sun, double the size of Sol, hung high above like an open wound in the sky. It had no clouds, no moisture, and no mercy. The heat radiated up from the ground, clawing into every open space. Even the wind was hot, like exhaled breath from a planetary forge. Each cadet activated tracking nodes and geo-beacons. Their mission was simple in concept: survive for 4 days, move to 4 preset coordinates, and complete the journey without external support. No orbital interference, no shuttle rescues, and no signal beacons unless one collapsed. In that case, the nearest cadet was expected to assist. Cooperation wasn't required, but it was watched. Lucas walked slowly, feeling the terrain under his boots. The sun hit the back of his head like a hammer, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he took a knee and scooped a handful of sand. It sifted through his fingers, light and bone dry. He placed a small thermopatch on the surface and waited. The readout blinked. 73 degrees Celsius, hotter than Death Valley on its worst day. He nodded to himself and moved forward, heading toward a low ridge of black basalt stone about 50 meters ahead. Behind him, the Draskian cadet scoffed again. "He's already losing it. He walks like a corpse." Lucas heard her but didn't respond. Instead, he focused on mapping shade. By midday, the sun was at its peak. Most cadets had found shelter under naturally formed arches or narrow canyons. Their suits beeped and buzzed, regulating their core temperature and cycling internal water. Lucas, meanwhile, had used a series of reflective foil panels tied to his walking sticks and secured with rock weights. He had built a small triangular shade just tall enough to sit under cross-legged. The foil reflected the heat upward, while the ground cooled slightly beneath him. He wrapped his scarf tightly, removed his shirt, and used his flask to dampen a piece of cloth. Placing it over his head, he pressed his palms to the cool underside of the rock slab above him and exhaled slowly through his nose. He wasn't cooling off, not really, but he was slowing down the heat's damage, managing it. That was what survival was: control, not elimination. A sharp beep echoed through the valley. A cadet had triggered a bio-warning. Lucas listened. The beep came again, followed by static. He looked over the ridge and saw the Zalari cadet stumbling, his suit's cooling gel dripping from his side like bright blue sap. The wind caught his unstable form and he crumpled into the sand. His respirator buzzed and clicked, struggling. Lucas didn't move. He waited. No other cadet made a move. Minutes passed. Finally, the Draskian jogged over and dragged the fainted cadet into a cave mouth with visible irritation. She activated his suit's emergency coil. The heat would bake them both inside, but it was the only chance. Lucas marked the moment in his mental log. First failure, 6 hours in. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked ground, Lucas gathered his panels and returned to walking. He moved with purpose, his pace set to the rhythm of his breath. He followed the terrain, seeking wind corridors and dark stones, indicators of temperature shifts. Occasionally, he'd stop and press his palm to the rocks, judging residual heat. He made small notches on his walking stick, measuring the sun's position relative to local stone formations. Navigation wasn't done through digital maps. It was written in heat and shadow. At sundown, the temperature dropped fast, almost violently. Alien cadets began to emerge from shelters, confused by the thermal whiplash. Their suits hissed, adjusting pressure and heating modes. Lucas wrapped his outer scarf tighter and found a low dune where wind was weakest. There, he dug a shallow trench and crawled inside, using the sand as insulation. He set a thermal stone beside him, charged earlier with solar heat, and leaned his head on his pack. Stars blinked into view overhead, sharp and countless. From his position, Lucas could hear faint voices. The cadets were speaking in their native tongues, some panicked, others frustrated. One mentioned suit recalibration errors. Another was worried about hydration levels. No one laughed anymore. The human hadn't collapsed. He hadn't even slowed down. Lucas closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. His skin felt tight and his lips were dry. But he was used to that. On Earth, you didn't fight the environment. You listened to it. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Lucas woke before the sky had shifted to light. The desert was still wrapped in a brittle silence, broken only by the faint buzz of distant suits auto-cycling their systems through nighttime routines. The sand around his body had cooled just enough to be bearable, though his thermal stone had long since lost its heat. He rolled onto one side, pushed himself up with a quiet grunt, and checked the sky. Cathara's dawn did not creep in slowly. It arrived like an ambush. The stars vanished almost instantly, and within minutes, the sun's massive form crested the ridge, smothering the landscape in a blood-orange haze. Heat returned not as warmth, but as pressure. Lucas brushed grit from his arms, rewrapped his scarf, and began to prepare for movement. He knew the first 2 hours after sunrise were critical. Most of the alien cadets would delay their progress until their suits reached proper calibration. Lucas didn't have that luxury, nor did he want it. The early light gave him visibility in tolerable conditions for at least 90 minutes. He unrolled a thin reflective sheet, folded it into a crude pack, and secured it to his back. Then he checked his flask, rationed 3 sips, and set off eastward. By the time he reached the base of the basalt ridge, the sun had fully breached the horizon. The sand was already warming beneath his boots, and the wind that rolled down from the high ridges carried with it a dry, metallic taste. He crouched near a jagged rock outcrop and took a moment to measure the shadows. They had shortened significantly since he last logged their angles. He made a quick etching on the inside of his walking stick, then pressed onward, eyes scanning for the next waypoint. He had covered nearly 2 kilometers by the time he heard the first distress call. It was faint, filtered through static, but unmistakable. A high-pitched series of distress pulses coming from the northwest quadrant. Lucas paused. He didn't change course immediately. Instead, he crouched and used a small sliver of metal to reflect sunlight toward the ridge behind him. After 3 pulses, he waited. No reply. That confirmed it. The source was a personal distress ping, not a coordinated broadcast. He altered his route by 20 degrees and moved into a jog. His breathing was even, but his muscles tensed with every step. The terrain had begun to shift. Patches of broken glass-like sand and shimmering blue mineral deposits spread across the basin. The air above them distorted slightly, creating shimmering illusions. Lucas narrowed his eyes. Heat pockets. Dangerous. He adjusted his path, zigzagging between the hottest zones, and reached a shallow gully. There, lying against a boulder, was the Zalari cadet. Tolan, if Lucas remembered correctly. His suit was fully sealed, but liquid was visibly leaking from beneath the chest regulator. The alien's usually translucent body was dulled, his limbs motionless except for a flickering hand gesture trying to reboot the system interface. Lucas didn't hesitate. He dropped beside him, tapped twice on the emergency panel, then peeled a strip of fabric from his pack and soaked it with water. He pressed it against the cadet's chest panel and immediately heard a hiss of steam. The suit's internal systems were overheating. The cooling cycle had failed. He reached behind the cadet's neck, found the manual release catch, and popped it open. The interior reeked of synthetic fluid and overheated polymer. Tolan's breathing was rapid and shallow. Lucas spoke low and firm. "Don't move. Close your eyes." "You're fine." He pulled the alien's upper body into a sitting position and began to fan air through the open port using his scarf. The internal temperature had to drop quickly, or the cadet's neurological responses would collapse into full shutdown. After several minutes, the twitching subsided. Tolan blinked once, then again, his eyes struggling to focus. Lucas gave him a sip from his flask. Not much, just enough to stimulate response. "I'll mark your location," Lucas said quietly. "You're not going anywhere today." He dragged the cadet beneath a ledge, set up a quick reflective shield, and placed 2 weighted rods beside him to hold it in place. He didn't linger. The sun was climbing fast, and every second mattered. By midday, Lucas had reached an elevated plateau dotted with mineral pillars. He scanned the horizon with his hand shielding his brow. Off in the distance, 2 cadets were crouched near a pile of jagged rocks, attempting to reconfigure one of their energy cores. Their suits blinked erratically, and steam curled from the leg vents of the larger cadet. Lucas moved on. He had no resources left to share. At Solar Peak, he located a narrow rock fissure between 2 leaning slabs and constructed a more elaborate shelter. He planted his sticks into the sand, stretched his foil tarp across them, and added a secondary layer of rock dust on top to absorb radiant heat. Then he sat cross-legged, his back to the rock, and closed his eyes. It wasn't sleep. It was energy preservation. His skin stung from the sunlight, especially where the mineral paste had worn off. He reapplied it sparingly, chewing a root extract tablet to suppress thirst. In the quiet, he focused on slowing his pulse. Sweat beaded along his ribs, gathered at his neck, and dripped silently to the sand. The evaporation cooled him slightly. Not much, but enough. The stillness was broken by movement. From above the ridge, the Draskian cadet appeared, her suit battered and glinting with microfractures. She dropped heavily to one knee and pulled off her helmet, gasping for air. Lucas remained seated, watching as she collapsed beside him without asking. Her voice rasped through the dryness. "I dragged 2 of them out of the rocks. Their suits failed. I had to—" She coughed violently. Lucas passed her the rest of his cloth wrap and nodded toward the flask. "Small sip. 1. She obeyed. Her pride had clearly been eroded by the day's punishment. Lucas didn't lecture her. He just handed her a second root tablet and gestured for her to stay under the shade. She looked at his setup, his simple, deliberate system of rock angles, foil stretch, and airflow channels, and narrowed her eyes. "You didn't guess this," she said hoarsely. "You've done this before." Lucas gave a short nod. "Earth has deserts too." She closed her eyes. "I thought humans were idiots. Dangerous, but reckless." Lucas stared ahead. "We usually are, but not when we're trying to stay alive." She laughed once, a dry, broken sound. Then silence returned. As the sun lowered, the landscape glowed orange and gold, painting everything in unreal color. Lucas stood, checked the sky's gradient, and began disassembling his shelter. The heat had lessened, but the night would bring sudden drops. He secured his gear and turned back to the Draskian cadet, who had managed to sit upright. "I'll leave a thermal stone for you," he said. "Stay sheltered. Keep breathing slow." She didn't argue. Lucas set off again, deeper into the canyon where waypoint 2 would be marked. His body ached from the tension, and he had less than half a flask remaining, but he moved with precision, deliberate, patient, never rushing. The canyon narrowed ahead, funneling wind into a colder channel. He welcomed it. The voices of the cadets had gone silent. No jokes, no mocking, just wind and stone and footsteps. Day 1 had broken most of them. Lucas was still standing. Lucas followed the canyon as it sloped downward into what the Academy's briefing had labeled a heat sink corridor, a deceptive term implying some reprieve. In reality, the narrow rock pass compressed hot air between the stone walls, funneling it like a breath from a furnace. Still, he preferred the partial shade it provided to the open plains above. His pace was steady, not because his strength hadn't waned, but because he had no room for mistakes. Every step required attention. One stumble could twist a knee, and in a place like this, that meant failure, or worse. By the time he reached the second waypoint, marked by a weathered steel pole buried in cracked stone, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the western cliffs. The shadows stretched long and sharp across the orange sand, splitting the ground into patches of searing light and quickly cooling dark. He logged the waypoint on his tracker and turned toward the closest ridge to scout for shelter before the night's chill arrived. The temperature would drop by nearly 60 degrees Celsius in less than 2 hours. He needed to dig in fast. As he climbed the ridge, a dull sound echoed through the canyon, an electric hum followed by a high-pitched mechanical whine. Lucas froze. The sound repeated, not a distress call this time, but a malfunction alarm. He moved quietly toward the source, following the sound until he saw a flicker of blue light blinking against the side of the cliff. A cadet in a lime-green suit lay half-submerged in sand, her helmet discarded and arms sprawled, face tilted toward the stone. Her body convulsed in short, irregular bursts. Steam poured from her backpack unit. The cooling chamber had burst. Lucas slid down the slope and crouched beside her. It was the Makari female, Prana, one of the more vocal skeptics during the pod descent. Her internal temperature must have reached lethal thresholds. Her eyes, usually a glinting violet, were now glassy. He pulled out his emergency cloth, soaked it, and pressed it against the base of her neck, the one location Makari skin absorbed cooling most efficiently. He had learned that weeks ago during interspecies physiology drills, not because he had to, but because he had known this would happen. She stirred. Her breathing was shallow, but her fingers twitched. He kept his voice low and steady. "Prana, listen. You need to stay still. Your cooling system failed. I'm stabilizing you." Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He worked quickly. He ripped the lower lining of her suit open, exposing her biocircuit harness. The interior wiring had melted, fusing into the shell. There was no salvaging it. He covered the gap with reflective foil, secured it with melted resin from his own supply tube, then built a shade dome from a half-collapsed section of her wing pack. It was clumsy but functional. She reached out suddenly, gripping his arm. Her voice, cracked and barely audible, rasped a single word. "Why?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He just looked at her. "Because I can," he finally said. He left her the remainder of his cloth and 2 mineral tablets, then moved on. He couldn't carry her, not without risking his own collapse. He made sure she was shaded and as hydrated as possible. The rest was up to her. By dusk, Lucas found a small overhang carved into a granite bluff and began clearing sand from beneath it. As he worked, he noticed a strange silence in the air. He hadn't heard any movement or voice in hours. The comm frequency had gone dead. Either the cadets had powered down to preserve energy, or their systems had failed completely. He built a wind barrier using 2 angled plates and secured them with stone wedges. Then he hunkered down with his back against the wall, wrapping himself tightly and letting his body enter a near meditative state. The wind picked up just before the last sunlight faded. It came low and dry, dragging grains of glassy sand across the ground like whispering knives. Lucas pressed his scarf higher up his neck and tucked his legs closer. The sky above burned with stars, dense and sharp, and the moon of Cathara, pale and cracked, hung in stillness overhead. His limbs ached, his lips were blistered, but his mind remained clear. Around midnight he heard movement, slow, uneven. A figure staggered into view across the ridge, silhouetted by moonlight. The form dropped to one knee, then crawled the rest of the way down toward the plateau. Lucas didn't rise. He watched. It was the Evadran cadet, Xeric, his tall frame barely supported by his powered suit. The lights on his back blinked erratically, then died. Lucas rose and approached. Xeric fell onto his side, face twisted in silent agony. His cooling unit hadn't just failed. It had exploded. The left side of his suit was blackened and partially melted. Lucas knelt beside him and pulled open the outer plate. Scalded skin glowed beneath the surface. He did what he could. He applied the last of his thermal paste and used a dry cloth to draw heat away from the burns. Zirich's breathing slowed. He looked at Lucas, his eyes wide. "I underestimated your kind," he whispered. Lucas didn't reply. "You walk like the sand knows you." Lucas leaned in slightly. "I walk like I've done this before." Zirich chuckled weakly, then grimaced in pain. Lucas left him beneath the overhang and returned to his own corner of rock. There was nothing else to do tonight. His rations were nearly gone. His flask was empty. But he had 2 more waypoints to reach, and only 2 more days to do it. His heart beat slowly, but consistently. The rhythm reminded him of desert nights back home. He imagined his father's voice telling him when to breathe, when to move, when to rest. That voice had taught him to survive, not in theory, but in dirt and sun and wind. In the final hour before dawn, a flash of light burst across the canyon. One of the suits had short-circuited fully. The blast echoed like distant thunder. Lucas didn't look up. Survival was no longer about the trial. It was now a matter of endurance, and the others were beginning to break. The 4th sunrise rose like a blade. No warmth, no softness, just a brutal, blinding radiance that sliced the sky open and baked the ground beneath it. Lucas had already been awake for over an hour, crouched silently beside a narrow ravine where the night's wind had buried him beneath a thin crust of sand. His body ached. The tendons in his legs protested every movement, and the skin around his mouth had cracked to the point where opening his jaw too wide sent a fresh sting of pain across his face. But he moved deliberately, always slowly, always forward. His flask was dry. He had known it would be. He had counted his sips, timed his intake, and stretched the last drops through the freezing hours. What remained now was nothing but grit at the bottom. Still, he capped it and tied it back to his belt. Habit had value here. The route to the 3rd waypoint was steeper than the last, with jagged black formations shaped by centuries of wind. The terrain was less predictable. Every few steps he paused to check for loose rock, testing his weight before committing to a climb. His hands had gone numb hours ago, not from cold, but from exhaustion. But he didn't stop. Stopping was a mistake. As he rounded the edge of a sharp ridge, he spotted movement above. At first, it was only a glint of light, then a shadow shifting along the cliff path. He ducked beneath a ledge and watched. The figure moved with purpose, but erratically, swaying with every step. As it drew closer, he recognized the tall, heavily armored frame of Commander Viel, one of the most physically powerful cadets in the entire trial. Viel was part of the Terakari species, a thick-scaled race whose bodies could withstand physical trauma that would destroy most others. She had towered over the other cadets during briefing and had mocked Lucas with visible disdain as he stepped off the pod without a suit. Her confidence had been absolute, but now her breathing was uneven. Her gait faltered. Lucas stood silently as she passed within 20 meters of his position, her massive boots crunching into the loose gravel, her hands trembling at her sides. The temperature had already reached dangerous levels. The cliff face around them reflected heat with terrible efficiency. He could see steam curling from the seals in her backplate. Without warning, her left leg gave out. She stumbled forward, caught herself on a rock, then sank to one knee. Lucas approached without hesitation. Vale looked up, her eyes squinting against the sun. Sweat dripped from her brow in thick rivulets, steam hissing from her shoulders. "You're still walking," she croaked, her voice hoarse and strained. Lucas didn't answer. He crouched beside her, examining the pack unit. Her coolant chamber had overheated. The secondary pump had failed. She had no water lines left intact. He reached for his pouch and pulled out a small thermal wrap. It was crude, but better than nothing. "You need to lie flat," he said. She grunted. "I'll finish the trial." "You'll die on the ridge." She tried to stand but collapsed back down. Her massive shoulders trembled. For a moment, Lucas thought she might strike him out of frustration. Instead, she slumped forward, hands planted in the dust. He placed the wrap against the back of her neck and pressed it down, forcing contact. He poured a few droplets of liquefied mineral cooling gel from his emergency reserve onto her armor joints. The hiss was immediate. the effect temporary. Vile gasped, then steadied. She looked at him again. "I don't understand how you're still functioning," she said. Lucas didn't respond. He began constructing a wind barrier from surrounding stones, angling it to channel airflow toward her collapsed body. When the structure was half finished, she reached out and gripped his wrist. "You're not just surviving," she said. "You're managing this." Lucas nodded once. "You don't fight the environment, you use it." A sound echoed in the distance, an energy discharge followed by an implosion. Another cadet's suit had failed catastrophically. The wind carried no scream, only the vibration of failure. Vielle exhaled slowly and released his arm. "This trial wasn't made for you," she muttered. "But now, it belongs to you." Lucas finished the shelter and handed her a cracked ceramic shell containing 2 drops of filtered moisture. It was all he could spare. She took it without pride. Pride had no place left here. From above the ridge, unseen by either of them, a set of observatory drones hovered in silence. Each recorded the exchange in perfect clarity, streaming it directly to the command vessel orbiting Cathara. Within the vessel's command chamber, several instructors and council delegates stood watching the feed. No one spoke. What they were witnessing contradicted years of protocol, data, and assumption. The lead instructor, a pale-skinned Zarethi named Commander Elun, crossed his arms. "That's the 6th collapse in less than 40 hours, he said. Beside him, Counselor Ress, a silvery-haired elder with one artificial eye, nodded grimly. 7th, if you include the Zalari. He hasn't moved in 16 hours. And the human? He has no suit, no supply cache, no aid. Yet he's now stabilized 4 cadets, remains mobile, and has consumed less than 1/3 the resources of the others." Commander Elun exhaled. "He's making the rest of our methods look foolish." Counselor Ress stepped forward, eyes locked on the drone footage as Lucas climbed the ridge once more, his body hunched but deliberate. "Not foolish," Ress corrected, "just overconfident." The observatory hall fell quiet. Back on the surface, Lucas reached the 3rd waypoint. It stood alone, an obsidian spire half buried in the sand, shimmering with embedded filaments. He pressed his identifier to the sensor plate and waited for the tone. It rang once. Confirmation. He looked out across the expanse toward the final stretch of the trial. The landscape flattened out, but the temperature would climb even higher during the approach. It would be a full day's march without shelter, and he had nothing left to ration. Still, he did not pause long. The sun continued to rise, and hesitation was the most dangerous indulgence of all. As he began the descent, Lucas spotted movement in the distance, 2 small figures approaching from the east. He recognized them quickly, the Makari cadet and the Zalari. Prana was limping, leaning against a walking rod she had fashioned from scrap. Tolan followed behind, his movement slower but steady. They were alive. Lucas smiled faintly, not because of victory, but because the desert hadn't taken them, not yet. He adjusted the straps on his pack, took a final look at the spire, and stepped forward. One more waypoint, one more day. The trial wasn't over, but the myth of superiority was. The final stretch unfolded like a sun-scorched corridor with no exit. The terrain had flattened, but the lack of elevation offered no relief, only exposure. Heat surged from every direction, even beneath Lucas's feet, where the ground pulsed with absorbed radiation. No shade existed here, no formations, just open horizon and a checkpoint barely visible through shimmering distortion in the distance. Lucas pressed on. His knees buckled slightly with each step, but he forced his weight forward. His feet had swollen against the inside of his boots, and the skin along his shoulders was raw where the straps of his makeshift pack had rubbed bone. Blisters had long since burst and dried into salt-crusted patches. He chewed on nothing. His mouth had stopped producing saliva hours ago, but his eyes remained clear, his thoughts focused. He had one more waypoint to reach. Behind him, faint but steady, came the slow approach of the 2 cadets he had seen from the ridge, Prana and Tolan. She had found a rhythm with her limp, using the rod as a 3rd limb. He no longer hovered but walked, awkward and upright. They moved with the quiet desperation of those who had faced death and had not yet forgotten its touch. The sun now hung directly overhead. Lucas no longer bothered with cloth wraps. The fabric had hardened, coated in minerals and sweat. His scarf had torn during the climb, and he had used part of it to bind a cut on his leg. What remained was instinct, discipline, and silence. When he reached the final marker, he didn't fall to his knees. He didn't cry. He simply stepped up to the polished obsidian column, pressed his palm to the activation pad, and waited for the confirmation tone. It was faint but clean. The spire lit up briefly with a pale blue glow, then dimmed. He turned around and watched as Prana collapsed beside the spire, her breath hitching, chest heaving. Tolan sat on the ground and pulled his knees to his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Above them, a low hum passed through the air. Moments later, a small shuttlecraft descended through the clouds. Its surface gleamed with polished chrome, the seal of the Intergalactic Academy emblazoned on the side. The door slid open without ceremony. No medals, no applause, no announcement. Just an invitation to board. Lucas waited for the others to climb in. Prana nodded at him once, not in thanks, not in surrender, but in shared understanding. Tolan gave a slight tilt of his head, something between exhaustion and respect. Then both disappeared into the vessel. He boarded last. Inside the shuttle, the lights were soft, the air cool, the seats padded. The shock of comfort hit him harder than the heat ever had. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling, where thin lines of bioluminescence mimicked a calm night sky. For the first time in 4 days, he allowed himself to close his eyes and feel nothing. When he opened them again, the shuttle had docked. The hangar was nearly silent. Counselors, instructors, and analysts lined the edges of the platform, standing beneath long banners that rippled faintly in the artificial breeze. Lucas stepped out of the shuttle with slow, precise movements. His clothes were stiff with dust, his eyes sunken, but he stood tall. The rest of the cadets were already there, those who had survived the trial. Some sat on med pads with IV lines in their arms, others leaned on one another for support. Vielle stood against a wall, her arms crossed, bandaged from hip to shoulder. Her eyes locked on Lucas the moment he appeared. She didn't speak, but she inclined her head slightly. Counselor Ress approached him directly. His silver hair shimmered beneath the lights, and his artificial eye adjusted with a sharp click as it scanned Lucas's condition. "No human cadet has ever completed this trial without mechanical assistance," Ress said. "You did it with none." Lucas didn't reply. Ress continued. "The Council prepared this exercise to evaluate performance under environmental stress. We expected failures. We did not expect a demonstration of mastery." Lucas still said nothing. His silence filled the chamber. Commander Elune stepped forward next. "You saved 4 cadets, stabilized another 2, took nothing you did not need, consumed less than the acceptable minimum, and reached every waypoint ahead of schedule." Lucas blinked slowly. Ress gave a small nod. "Some will call it primitive. Others will call it instinct. But what you showed us, what we recorded, was not survival. It was command." Murmurs rippled through the council lines. "We debated giving you a formal commendation," Ress said. "A rank, even a teaching position." Lucas tilted his head slightly. Ress's expression softened. "But I suspect you have no interest in staying." Lucas finally spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "You brought me here to test if I'd break. I didn't. That's enough." Ress let the silence settle, then stepped back. The crowd parted slowly as Lucas walked past, his steps echoing across the hangar floor. No one applauded. No one dared. The room had become reverent. As Lucas reached the outer corridor, he paused beside the registry wall, an etched display of cadet names, ranks, and planetary origins. At the very bottom, newly engraved, was a single line. Lucas Bray Earthborn completion status, unassisted. He traced it with one finger, then continued walking. He didn't wait for transport. He didn't turn around. Outside the Academy's vessel, the stars pulsed in silence. Lucas stood at the edge of the viewing bay, staring into the black. Around him, other cadets would be processed, studied, and praised, but none of that mattered. He had proven what he came to prove, not to the Council, not to the instructors, but to himself. The galaxy had measured him by its standards. He had answered in his own.